When the internet began, bulletin board services, or BBS, became the first online communities of the so-called information superhighway. Using their phone lines, people logged in from all over America to talk about sports, games, movies, and on one BBS in particular, share their ghost stories. Over time, those communities all went dark, except for one lone server that continues to operate somewhere in an unknown part of Pennsylvania's Rust Belt. A relic of the 1990s, veiled in mystery, it is a digital archive of humanity's strangest encounters with the unknown, as told by the people who experienced them. My name is Brandon Schexnayder, and you are listening to Fear Daily.
Subject, Boxcar Pete. User, 1888 Run. Posted, June 23, 1994.
In my youth, I thought the closest you could come to heaven on earth was watching the moonlit desert roll past you, empty and silent except for the rumbling train you were riding on. Those moments felt like sublime communion with something greater than myself, and to spread out on the wind so I could become a permanent part of it was my greatest wish. Not that I wanted to die, far from it. No, I wanted to retain who I was while simultaneously becoming a part of everything and everyone. It shows you the romantic ignorance of youth because, in reality, riding the rails was always closer to death than it ever was to that. It was almost a quarter century ago that I spent my final night in a boxcar. By that point, I'd been on the road for a little more than 5 years, following the warm weather. Like a surprising number of people I met in those days, I wasn't out there fleeing bad circumstances. It was actually the opposite. I came from a safe suburban town where nothing very interesting ever happened. All I saw around me was people continuing to live without ever moving forward. Eat, sleep, screw, repeat. To me, it seemed like a rough draft of a life. Bullet points without anything to give them meaning. I wanted more, even if I couldn't tell you what exactly that meant. My inspiration for sneaking on board my first train was Henry Keene, my grandfather, who died long before I was ever born. Henry had been a hobo during the Depression, riding across the country to find work and sending money home. Something like 4 million Americans took to the rails in that period just trying to survive. Many of them didn't, my grandfather among them. When the letters stopped coming, my Grandma Ruth thought he'd given up on them, which wasn't uncommon. It was a long time before she found out what really happened. He was mistakenly locked in a boxcar that was then shunted down to a little-used siding outside of Yuma, Arizona. It was impossible to know whether the heat or the starvation had gotten to Henry first. Either way, the end result was my grandmother raising my father by herself. More than anything, I was thinking about Grandma Ruth that last night on the road. During my previous visit home, she'd been in poor health, and my need to be in constant motion was at odds with a lingering feeling she wouldn't be with us much longer. I'd had time to think about it since jumping aboard the train in Eureka, Missouri. It was a lumbering 100-plus car freight, hauling, among other things, what looked like to be multiple fuel tankers. The yard in Eureka was always pretty lax, and I found an unlocked boxcar without too much trouble. I had learned over the years that there was a code to living this way, and one of the rules is you don't bust a lock on a boxcar. It pisses off the bulls, railway police, and train yards are lonely places to spend time with a pissed-off cop. Once you head towards the northeast of Missouri and into Illinois, you leave the forest behind in favor of small towns and eventually cities like St. Louis. Even though I was no fan of domesticity, I found myself watching for signs of life through the half-open curtains of passing houses. I'd look for flickers of TV screens in the darkness, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it is that they might be watching. It must have been after midnight when we rolled through St. Louis, underneath its canopy of highway clover leaves and onward into the steel warren that was the Fairmont City rail yard. Unless you were getting off, being stopped on a train meant you kept quiet so as not to attract attention. I couldn't hear anyone outside, but even so, I made sure to stay still until I felt that familiar rumble beneath me as we began to move again. Before we could get up to speed, the boxcar door was thrown open and a heavy sock tossed in. A moment later, I heard a voice from outside say, "A little help?" Cautiously, I approached the open door and looked down. A young man was lightly jogging next to the train. He had tossed his bag to make climbing in easier. I dropped to one knee and braced myself against the wall, extending a hand which he grabbed. With a grunt, I pulled the man on board. He made it just in time. The landscape was whizzing past now. First, the General Chemical plant's towering industrial ramparts, then the sloping green hills of the mounds at Cahokia. The hitcher hadn't moved since climbing in, choosing to stay sitting where he had landed on the car's floor. He looked to be a little older than me. His brown hair shaggy in the same clumsy style I'd seen on a lot of riders who had to cut it themselves or had a less than sober friend to do it. See something green? I shook my head. Sorry, no, it's been a little while since I've seen someone else who wasn't a bull is all. He nodded his head quickly. Yeah, that'll do it. Come on, Sid, you want to smoke? Least I can do for you helping me out. That sounded just fine to me, and I told him so. He gestured for me to sit while he pulled his bag closer and started digging. It looked to be handmade, old and beat to hell, more of a cloth sack rigged up with a shoulder strap. It made me a little self-conscious about my own backpack, which I'd straight up bought from an army surplus store somewhere along the line. From inside the sack, he pulled out a stained drawstring pouch, setting it on his lap. Everything about him was authentic in a way I hated and admired at the same time. His hand had been calloused, meaning he was a hobo as opposed to a tramp. Hobos worked as they went, tramps mostly didn't. I wasn't about asking for a handout, so I fell in the latter camp. My bag was store-bought, my cigarettes, when I could get them, machine-rolled by the fine folks at Winston and Marlboro, whereas he was sprinkling something that wasn't quite tobacco onto a square of dirty paper. The apprehension of my face must have been obvious because the hitcher gave me a crooked smile. It's half and half tobacco and corn silk. Helps the tobacco last longer. Got a light? I fished for my Zippo, flicking the lighter, another surplus find, until it produced a flame. The hitcher took a drag from the smoke before handing it over. To my embarrassment, the mixture hit my lungs hard and made me cough immediately. The rider laughed and slapped my knee. They're not for everybody. After a couple puffs, I got used to the unusual mixture, and we sat there smoking in silence as Illinois farmland rolled past. We continued that way long after the rollie had been puffed away to nothing and ground out on the boxcar's floorboards up until the first rays of morning streaked across the sky. I couldn't stop thinking about Grandma Ruth and that feeling of time growing short. Seemingly out of nowhere, the rider decided to speak again. "You seem like a man with things on his mind." I sighed. "Yeah, I guess I am. Want to talk about it? We got the time." I watched a line of cornstalks bob in the fading, rose-tinged darkness, then vanish behind us. It's family. Someone's sick, and I feel like I'm running out of time to see them. "I'm sorry to hear that, really." He clapped a hand on my shoulder. It was unexpected, but reassuring all the same. "If it's getting down to the wire like that, why don't you just go?" I shrugged. "I don't know. I'm afraid of getting stuck, I guess. Of going back home and becoming a permanent part of the landscape, of living a life I don't want." The stranger nodded thoughtfully. "Lots of folks fall that way, no doubt. Of course, there are just as many out here doing that as there are back home." "You figure." He pulled out a cigarette. I had noticed him rolling and stuck it in his lip. The Zippo's orange glow lit him in a way I hadn't yet seen. He may have been young, but his face was hard and tired. Sure, this whole thing started out as something people had to do, not in a called-to-it way either. They had people depending on them and no way to provide where they were. So out they went. It wasn't an escape from home, it was a way to keep it alive so one day you could go back. The only ones who stayed out here didn't have homes to go back to. Getting the shit beat out of you by cops, freezing your ass off, or getting heat stroke while you chase your tail trying to feed yourself, it's a hell of a way to live and an even worse way to die, especially if you don't have to. So why are you still out here? Because by the time I finally figured myself out and found a way home, there were strangers living in my house. After that, there was silence between us, punctuated only by the rhythmic click-clack of the rails. My companion sighed heavily. Even if the sun wasn't quite ready to peek over the horizon yet, you could tell that before long the people in those little houses we were passing would soon be waking up and going about their lives. Golden slats of morning light filtered in through gaps in the boxcar's walls, striping the both of us. Look, far be it from me to tell anyone what to do. After all, I'm out here same as you, but you got people and one of them needs you. Why not go deal with that now and figure out the rest later? The rails aren't going anywhere. I can guarantee if you don't, you'll regret it for the rest of your life. A shudder shook the car, followed by a grinding noise that could only be the brake. This is Champaign-Urbana coming up. Last chance. If you get out here, the buses will take you wherever you have to go, and I promise you'll have time to get to her. Stay on board this rattler, and there'll be no time at all. I weighed my options. If either of my parents had been the one telling me this, I would have ignored them. Could have pointed out flaws in the argument and found a way to keep doing what I wanted to do in the first place. But this guy was the person I felt like I wanted to be, and even he was telling me to go. As a grown man, I look back and realize how shallow a decision this was, but when you're young, you don't realize how badly you want approval from people you admire. I nodded at his words. Okay, you're right. I'll jump off here. My companion smiled broadly, some of the hardness easing away. Good. I'm glad to hear it. He relaxed back and took a last drag from his smoke. A railway cop walking the train kept me from hopping out until it was just about in motion again. I hurriedly jumped down from my perch and managed to slow my momentum enough so I wasn't going to fall over. "Peter," the stranger's voice called out from behind me. "Heads up." When I turned, he was tossing my backpack down from the rapidly receding boxcar. It thumped into my chest and I clutched it tight. The process was so quick it took me several seconds to recall I'd never told him my name. He then leaned way out, shouting to be heard as the train whistle announced its departure. "Tell Ruthie I'm sorry. It wasn't meant to be this way, but when she's ready, I'll be waiting." The final wave, my grandfather disappeared back inside the boxcar, closing the door behind him. Less than 2 hours later, 16 cars from that train, the Toledo, Peoria, and Western Railroad Company number 20, derailed in the town of Crescent City, Illinois. 10 fuel tankers, including one next to the boxcar I'd been riding in, exploded in the aftermath, starting a fire that burned for more than 50 hours. According to news reports, there wasn't a single fatality. Of course, I wouldn't find that out until much later. At the time, all I saw was distant flames dancing in the sunrise from the window of a Greyhound bus as we passed by.
Subject, The Choice. User, PeelX. Posted, April 9th, 1998.
You ever wonder who you are? I mean, who you really are if you strip away all those stories you tell yourself about yourself? You know, the composite image you've drawn from all the things others have reflected back at you and the way your insides made you feel, or the personality you claim to have that might actually be built less on reality and more on avoiding discomfort. Do you really know? Well, if you're curious, I've got an offer you can't refuse. 100% money-back guarantee. It's simple. You sit in this chair, close your eyes, and when you open them, you'll see yourself as you could have been. Not just one version, but all of them. Every turn you didn't take, every door you let shut, every risk you dodged, every love you walked away from. All standing there in front of you. Talking, moving, breathing. Friend, this is the real deal, and don't bother asking how. I've had customers laugh, weep, scream, and beg. Some try to fight. One guy even threw up. I won't lie, it's a lot to take in. Seeing yourself as the person who chased the dream, as the one who played it safe, the one who never left, or the one who left everything behind, it can be emotional. But the most unsettling to most is seeing how small choices ripple into entire lives. It rattles people to their core. But friend, here's the kicker. You don't just see these versions of yourself like a movie passing before your eyes. You feel what they feel. That rush of adrenaline from the version of you who took the big risks, the contentment of the you who found peace in the ordinary, the aching regret of the you who let someone special slip away. I'll be honest, this is not for the weak-hearted. It's not for the ones who want to sleep easy at night. Once you know, you know. But if you really want to know, if you can handle the weight of truth, I'll set up the chair. No strings attached, 100% money back guarantee. Although I can promise you won't leave the same person you arrived as. Now, over the years, people come to me for many, many reasons. Some want validation that the life they have is the best one they could have lived. Others want answers to see if the one, that pretty lady who got away, was truly meant to be, or some just want to scratch the itch of what if, thinking they can handle it like a funhouse mirror at a carnival. They're always wrong. I had a guy once, a doctor, mid-40s, married, 3 kids. He walked in cool as ice, told me he had no regrets, that he was just curious. I strapped him in, told him to close his eyes and let the journey begin. When he opened them, he saw himself, a different self, standing tall in a lecture hall. Unmarried, childless, but a world-renowned researcher on the cusp of curing something big. The weight of discovery in his eyes, the fire of a life spent chasing knowledge untethered by domestic obligations. He stared for what to him must have felt like hours, barely breathing. Then he reached out, tried to touch the version of himself standing before him. I told him not to, but he either wouldn't or couldn't listen. The vision shattered like glass, and he started sobbing. Not just crying, sobbing like a man who had just lost everything, except he never had it to begin with. They all think they can handle it. Most can't. A woman once came to me. She was in her mid-60s, a widow. She told me she just wanted to see if her late husband was in fact the love of her life, or if there had been another path she should have taken. She sat in the chair, closed her eyes, and when she opened them, she saw herself at 24 standing at a crossroads. One path led to the life she lived, a warm, stable marriage with children, grandchildren, comfort. The other, a life of adventure, of running away with someone else, a man who made her pulse quicken, who made her feel alive in a way her husband never quite did. She saw herself boarding a train with him, her hand in his, laughing, weightless. She saw what would have been a whirlwind romance spanning continents, a life lived on passion and spontaneity. But then she saw how it ended. A life of loneliness when he left her for someone younger. She was penniless and beaten down. That day, she saw a love that burned too bright and too fast. When the session ended, she just sat there, staring at the wall. I asked her if she wanted to talk about it. She shook her head, left, and never came back. I wonder sometimes if she regretted it. But look, obviously, this isn't just about seeing a better life. I'm not here to pick at your choices. No, it's about seeing different lives. And once you know what else was possible, the life you return to never feels quite the same. For some, that is the type of empowering knowledge that leads them to create a future so beautiful even the chair couldn't have expected it. But most, well, money back guarantee. As for me, I don't sit in the chair. I won't. I know better. Unlike my customers, I made my choice a long time ago.
Fear Daily is an independent podcast hosted by Brandon Schexnayder and written by Brennan Storr, with Joanna Smith serving as the consulting editor, audio production by Rachel Boyd, and sound design by Southern Gothic Media. This podcast is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, and incidents are either products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or to real events or locations, is entirely coincidental. Ad-free versions of Fear Daily are available now on your favorite podcast apps. For more information, visit feardaily.com. But move fast, before the server goes offline.